Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, stretching across Utah and Arizona, is a vast and mesmerizing landscape of contrasts. While millions of tourists are drawn to the iconic, azure waters of Lake Powell, flanked by its soaring sandstone walls, this is merely the facade of a much deeper, wilder, and more enigmatic territory. Beyond the buzzing houseboats and popular shoreline campsites lie hundreds of square miles of desolate, uncharted backcountry. It is a labyrinth of side canyons, sheer sandstone cliffs, vast mesas, and treacherous slot canyons, where the sun beats down with relentless intensity. GPS signals falter in the narrow stone passages, and cell phone service is a forgotten luxury. In the summer of 2015, 28-year-old Daniel Carter set out for this very wild heart of the recreation area. He was an experienced and seasoned hiker, a man actively seeking solitude and a profound connection with the raw, untamed earth. He found it. But the full, horrifying price of that solitude would only become known to the world 3 years later, in the scorching August of 2018. Daniel Carter was the antithesis of a reckless novice. At 28, living in Phoenix, Arizona, he worked as a software engineer. Friends and family described him as methodical, intelligent, and exceptionally physically fit. His preparations for hikes were legendary, involving detailed topographical maps, weather analysis, and meticulously curated gear. He wasn't chasing the adrenaline rush of free soloing cliffs. He was pursuing the deep, resonant silence that can only be found dozens of miles from the nearest human voice, a silence that speaks volumes to the soul. Solitary hikes were his preferred method of decompression from the digital cacophony of his daily life. Glen Canyon was a planned segment of his extended 3-week vacation in June 2015. His intention was to spend several days deep in the backcountry, exploring the intricate and less-traveled network of canyons that feed into the main lake channel, far from the noise of jet skis and tour boats. His specific route was not formally registered with the park authorities, a common practice among confident solo backpackers who value flexibility and spontaneity over rigid, pre-approved itineraries. His last known communication was a brief text message to a friend, stating he was heading into the canyons north of Bullfrog, a message that would later become the starting point for a desperate search. Daniel Carter was last seen alive by a cashier at a small, rustic marina store in the town of Bullfrog, Utah. He was purchasing extra water purification tablets and high-calorie trail snacks. The cashier later recalled a brief, friendly conversation. Daniel mentioned he was heading into the canyons, but was specifically looking for areas where the boat crowds don't go. He expressed interest in exploring the complex maze of canyons between the Moody Creek and the Orange Cliffs area. This region is well known to the park's rangers. It's stunningly beautiful with its layered Navajo sandstone, but inherently treacherous. It is not officially recommended for solo travel due to its extreme remoteness, complex navigation challenges, and lack of any reliable water sources outside the main lake. The terrain there is a dissected plateau, a complex web of canyons within canyons, many of which end in sheer, impassable pour-offs or require technical climbing gear to navigate. Animal trails often vanish into nothingness, and the risk of rockfall is constant. Cell phone service in the deep recesses of these canyons is non-existent. It is dangerously easy to become disoriented there, and once lost, it is a monumental task for rescuers to locate a missing person. All evidence suggests that Daniel Carter ventured into this very region. A week passed. Daniel had a firm agreement with his family to make contact by a specific date. He was notoriously reliable about these check-ins. When the call never came, his sister in Phoenix began to worry. Her initial calls to his cell phone went straight to voicemail. After 48 hours of escalating anxiety, she officially reported him missing. The National Park Service in coordination with the Garfield County Sheriff's Office, immediately launched a large-scale search and rescue operation. The first significant clue was the discovery of his vehicle. It was found parked at a remote trailhead on the north side of the recreation area, a dirt pullout that provided access to the winding canyons leading toward the Orange Cliffs. This discovery confirmed the searchers' deepest fears. Daniel was somewhere in that vast, unforgiving wilderness. The search was extensive and grueling. Dozens of rangers, specially trained volunteers, and canine search teams participated. Helicopters were deployed, their crews performing low-level, painstaking sweeps over the canyon systems, searching for any flash of color from a tent, jacket, or a distress signal spelled out with rocks. Rescuers on the ground combed known routes and then began the arduous task of rappelling into deep ravines and scouring side canyons. But the Orange Cliffs area is immense, a sprawling wilderness of stone. Search teams battled extreme conditions. The June heat in the Utah desert was oppressive, with temperatures often soaring above 100 mark 38 degrees Celsius. The rugged terrain required technical climbing skills and equipment to access many of the most promising and most dangerous locations. Despite their heroic efforts, they found nothing. No discarded wrapper, no footprint in a patch of soft sand, no broken branch, no trace of a campsite. Daniel Carter had vanished, as if the desert itself had swallowed him whole. After several weeks, the active ground and air search was scaled back and ultimately suspended. Investigators were left with several plausible theories, all tragic, yet logical for the environment. The most likely scenario was a tragic accident. Daniel could have taken a misstep and fallen from one of the countless high ledges. In such a case, his body could have come to rest in a deep, shadowed crevice or beneath a ledge, invisible from both the air and the ground. The second theory involved the harsh elements. Dehydration and heat stroke can incapacitate a person with terrifying speed. A disoriented hiker, even an experienced one, could quickly succumb without water. The third possibility, though considered less likely, was an encounter with wildlife, such as a mountain lion. In any of these scenarios, the window for a successful recovery diminished with each passing day. The official case was classified as missing, presumed deceased. For his family, 3 years of an agonizing, silent purgatory began. A limbo, where not knowing was a torture worse than any definitive, however grim, truth. They could not have imagined that the truth, when it finally emerged, would be far more monstrous than a simple fall, thirst, or an animal attack. For 3 years, the deep canyons of Glen Canyon guarded their secret. Then, in August 2018, a chance discovery by 2 amateur geologists shattered the silence. 3 years had slipped by without a single, credible lead. For Daniel Carter's family, the pain of not knowing was a constant, dull ache. Search parties had long since departed, and his file had become a cold case in the National Park Service's records, another tragic statistic of a wilderness that demands respect. The official conclusion was missing, presumed dead as a result of an accident. But in August 2018, that silence was irrevocably broken. 2 young geologists, graduate students from the University of Utah, were conducting fieldwork on the sandstone formations in the Orange Cliffs region. Like Daniel 3 years earlier, they were operating far from the beaten path, seeking specific, unspoiled geological outcrops. They were traversing a particularly remote and dry side canyon, one that required skilled navigation and a good level of fitness to access. The canyon floor was a jumble of house-sized boulders and ancient weathered juniper trees. As they meticulously documented the striations in the rock, one of them glanced up toward the canyon wall, his attention caught by something anomalous. Amidst the dense, gnarled branches of a lone, ancient juniper tree, Perched about 15 feet up the slope, he noticed an unnatural shape. It was a figure, suspended motionless. Their initial, rational assumption was that it was discarded debris, perhaps an old, sun-bleached mannequin left by vandals, or a bundle of trash caught in the tree. But a growing sense of unease compelled them to investigate further. They scrambled up the treacherous talus slope for a closer look, and what they saw made them freeze in their tracks before hastily retreating. On a thick, horizontal branch of the juniper tree, approximately 15 feet above the ground, hung a human form. The body was fully skeletonized, but tattered remnants of outdoor clothing, a faded plaid shirt and durable hiking pants, still clung to the bones. The students did not linger. They immediately retreated from the canyon, their scientific focus replaced by a primal urgency, and began the long, arduous hike back to an area with a sliver of cell phone reception. Once they reached their vehicle, they immediately called 911. The call was routed through the complex jurisdiction to the National Park Service Rangers at Glen Canyon and the Garfield County Sheriff's Office. Crucially, the students were able to provide precise GPS coordinates from their handheld GPS unit, a detail that would prove invaluable. Without those coordinates, finding that specific, unmarked location in the vast labyrinth of identical-looking canyons would have been a near-impossible task. A joint investigative team, comprising park rangers, sheriff's deputies, and a forensic anthropologist, was dispatched to the scene. Access to the narrow canyon was difficult, requiring a lengthy off-road drive followed by a technical descent into the ravine itself. The scene they uncovered was even more chilling and deliberate than the initial report had suggested. Human remains were indeed suspended from the tree. After 3 years of exposure to the blistering sun, freezing winters, and scavenging animals, the body was largely skeletal. However, the most horrifying aspect was not the mere presence of the remains, but the clear evidence of post-mortem staging. The skeleton wasn't simply draped over the branch, it was meticulously secured to it. Robust, weather-resistant nylon straps, identical to those used for securing camping gear or on high-end backpacks, were tightly lashed around the torso and the thick tree limb. The knots were complex and secure, clearly tied by human hands, with a specific, purposeful intent. The body had been positioned in a seated, almost upright posture, making the scene unnervingly theatrical. It had been hung in a way that kept it elevated beyond the easy reach of ground scavengers, which likely contributed to its preservation in this macabre tableau. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Upon closer inspection, the team confirmed their initial, dreadful suspicion. The skeleton was missing its skull. A preliminary examination of the remains at the site revealed other brutal details. The small bones in the hands and fingers of both hands were crushed and fractured. The forensic anthropologist on site noted that the nature of these breaks was consistent with blunt force trauma, likely inflicted peri-mortem or around the time of death. Furthermore, both knee joints showed severe trauma, with dislocations and fractures suggesting the application of extreme, deliberate force. This pattern of injury did not align with an accidental fall. It did not match the damage typically caused by animal predation. It pointed unequivocally to a sustained, violent, and personal assault. The team conducted a meticulous grid search of the area surrounding the tree. The rocky, uneven ground made finding small clues difficult. But directly beneath the hanging body, partially buried in the sand and gravel, they discovered 2 key items. The first was a high-quality camping knife, still in its hardened polymer sheath. When investigators carefully removed it, they noted that the tip of the blade was broken off, and the edge was badly chipped and dented, as if it had been used to pry at something extremely hard or had been struck with tremendous force. Lying nearby was an empty, sun-bleached canvas holder for a standard military-style canteen. The canteen itself was missing. Daniel Carter's backpack, which should have contained his food, shelter, water filter, and most importantly, his wallet and identification, was conspicuously absent. The absence of the skull presented a major obstacle to formal identification. However, 3 days after the grim discovery in the canyon, a park ranger team, conducting an expanded search of the surrounding high ledges for any additional evidence, made a second, critical find. Approximately 1 mile from the first site, on a high, rocky promontory, favored by turkey vultures, they noticed a large accumulation of bones at the base of the cliff, directly below a nesting area. Scavenger birds often drop parts of their carry-on. Sifting carefully through the scattered animal remains, the rangers discovered what they were searching for: the heavily damaged remnants of a human skull. The skull was gnawed and weathered, but it retained a nearly complete set of upper teeth. All the remains, the skeleton from the juniper tree and the skull fragments from the cliff, were carefully collected, documented, and transported under chain of custody protocols to the Utah State Medical Examiner's Office in Salt Lake City. The investigation now had a primary objective: positive identification. The cold case file of Daniel Carter, who had vanished in the same area 3 years prior, was immediately brought to the forefront. His dental records were urgently requested from his dentist in Phoenix and expedited to the forensic odontologist. A comparison of the dental work and unique tooth formations on the recovered skull with Carter's dental x-rays showed a definitive, positive match. For absolute scientific certainty, DNA analysis was performed, comparing a bone sample with a DNA sample provided by his sister. The result was unequivocal. The remains found deliberately lashed to a tree, and the skull recovered from the vulture's nest belonged to Daniel Carter. The mystery of his disappearance was now solved, but it was immediately replaced by another, far more terrifying enigma. Daniel Carter had not perished in a simple accident. He had not gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. What had happened to him in that remote canyon was the work of another human being, a work of malice, torture, and deliberate concealment. The case was now a homicide investigation. The identification of Daniel Carter formally transformed a missing person case into a murder investigation. The focus shifted entirely to the forensic experts in Salt Lake City, whose task was to reconstruct the events of 3 years ago from the silent testimony of bones and decayed fabric. Examining skeletal remains is a complex science, but bones can tell a vivid and horrifying story of a person's final moments. The first line of evidence was the clothing. Though the fabrics were sun-rotted and brittle, dark, rust-colored stains were still visible on the shirt and around the collar. Laboratory analysis confirmed it was human blood. Additionally, the clothing showed numerous rips and abrasions that, according to forensic textile analysts, were inconsistent with normal wear and tear or a fall. The pattern suggested a violent struggle, perhaps the victim being dragged roughly across the rocky ground. But the most telling and horrifying narrative was written in the bones themselves. While the soft tissues were long gone, the skeletal injuries spoke volumes. Daniel Carter had suffered multiple broken ribs on his right side. The fracture patterns indicated these were the result of direct, high-impact blows, likely from kicks or a blunt object, not the compressive force of a fall. Damage was also noted to the lower sternum and vertebrae, suggesting severe, focused trauma to the torso. The injuries to the fingers and knees, first noted at the scene, were confirmed as ante-mortem inflicted while he was still alive. The picture that emerged was not one of a quick kill, but of prolonged, methodical torture. The perpetrator had systematically broken and brutalized Daniel Carter's body. However, according to the medical examiner's final report, none of these devastating injuries were the direct cause of death. The definitive answer lay in a small, delicate bone in the neck, the hyoid bone. examination revealed a clear, classic fracture. This type of fracture is a telltale sign of manual strangulation. Daniel Carter had been choked to death. This critical finding meant the attack was controlled and personal. The killer had not simply shoved him off a cliff in a moment of conflict. He had first subjected him to excruciating pain, breaking his bones, and then, in a final, intimate act of violence, had ended his life with his bare hands. The hanging of the body was a post-mortem act, a gruesome ritual of display, a means to confuse investigators, or a twisted effort to hide the body from casual discovery by elevating it. The fact that Daniel's backpack and other personal items were never found added another sinister layer. Was this a robbery gone horrifically wrong? Or did the killer take the backpack as a trophy, a memento of his violent act? This grim discovery prompted detectives to re-examine the park's archives with a new, darker lens. They were no longer looking for accident reports. They were hunting for a potential serial predator who used the park's vast remoteness as a hunting ground. Detectives began cross-referencing all unsolved cases, missing person reports, and even vague complaints of suspicious activity within Glen Canyon and surrounding areas during that time frame. They uncovered an alarming pattern. In 2014, a year before Daniel Carter's disappearance, and again in 2016, a year after, 2 other male solo hikers had vanished without a trace in the same general vicinity of the Orange Cliffs. Their bodies had never been found, and their cases were also attributed to the expected perils of the wilderness. Now, these cases were reopened as potential homicides, possibly linked to the same offender. Further digging into old ranger reports revealed another, equally disturbing series of incidents. Between 2013 and 2016, the Glen Canyon Ranger Station had periodically received complaints, primarily from female tourists and solo hikers. They reported encounters with a suspicious man who often presented himself as a volunteer ranger or a Park Service researcher. The modus operandi was consistently eerie. This individual would approach people in remote areas using his faux authority to gain trust. He would offer to show them secret archaeological sites or more scenic off-trail routes. His demeanor was described as overly confident and pushy. However, when questioned directly about his official status or asked to see his Park Service identification, he would quickly become agitated and vanish into the labyrinth of canyons. Despite several attempts to identify him, his true identity had never been uncovered. These threads, the sadistic murder of Daniel Carter, 2 other unsolved disappearances with similar victim profiles, and the reports of a manipulative imposter began to weave together into a deeply unsettling picture. The investigation, however, stalled without a direct suspect. The breakthrough seemed to come in early 2019 when detectives, painstakingly reviewing personnel records of former seasonal employees and volunteers, came across a name that raised red flags: Brandon Sharp. He had worked as a seasonal maintenance volunteer for the park concessionaire during the relevant period, from 2013 to 2017. His employment was terminated in 2017, just a year before Carter's body was found, for a serious and bizarre infraction. He was caught in possession of a forged Park Service volunteer ID badge and had been repeatedly witnessed wearing decommissioned Park Service uniform components. Brandon Sharp was immediately located and brought in for questioning regarding the Daniel Carter case. He was living in a remote community in southern Utah. During the interrogation, he remained calm and detached, flatly denying any involvement in Carter's disappearance or any knowledge of the fake ranger incidents. He claimed his dismissal was the result of a misunderstanding and an overzealous passion for the park. Investigators executed a search warrant on his property. No direct, incontrovertible evidence, such as Daniel Carter's personal belongings, the murder weapon, or DNA linking him to the body, was found. However, in a locked toolbox in his shed, detectives made a significant discovery: they found a detailed, heavily annotated topographical map of the Orange Cliffs region. The map was old, creased from repeated folding, and covered in handwritten notes, symbols, and coordinates. Several specific locations were marked with small, precise X's. One of these marked coordinates, when entered into a GPS unit, sent a chill down the lead detective's spine. The coordinates on Brandon Sharp's worn map matched the GPS coordinates of the remote side canyon, where Daniel Carter's body was found, lashed to the juniper tree, with a margin of error of less than 20 feet. It was the most compelling piece of circumstantial evidence they had. Yet, it was not enough. Brandon Sharp, when confronted, calmly stated that as an avid explorer and former volunteer, he had extensively mapped the area for his own personal interest and for potential route finding for search and rescue. He claimed the coordinate was merely a note of an interesting geological feature he had found. Without a witness, a confession, or direct physical evidence placing him at the murder scene, the district attorney declined to file charges, citing insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. The murder of Daniel Carter remains officially unsolved. The final investigative report concludes, the victim was the subject of a brutal, premeditated homicide involving torture and strangulation. The methods used, including the post-mortem staging of the body, indicate a perpetrator with a sadistic motive and likely knowledge of the remote backcountry. The case is classified as an open but inactive homicide. The perpetrator has not been identified. The profound mystery of what truly transpired in that silent, sun-baked canyon in June 2015 remains locked within the ancient sandstone. The question of whether Brandon Sharp was a clever killer who used the wilderness as his cloak, or merely an eccentric hiker with poor judgment, remains a haunting, unanswered question for the investigators who worked the case and for the family of Daniel Carter, who are left with the horrifying details of his final moments, but without the closure of justice.